Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our, I think, 6th or 7th interdisciplinary lecture by the neuroepigenetics team. I'm Christine Hens, I'm the PI of the team, and I'm very happy that today we have here Valeria Bizzari, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the KU Leuven at the Husserl Institute, but she has worked on autism, specifically on the history of autism, and she was willing to give a presentation and to talk to us about that today, so we're very happy for that. For those of you who haven't joined any of these interdisciplinary lectures yet, I would like to give some background. Neuroepigenetics is a interdisciplinary team sponsored by an ERC starting grant, and we seek to investigate concepts of biology and ethical questions relating to neurodevelopmental phenomena such as Tourette, autism, and ADHD. We do that from many different perspectives. We believe that experience stories are important. We believe that a truly developmental epigenetic perspective is important. Are captures available? I'll see if I can switch that on. Is there a possibility in Zoom to generate captions? I will look at it. I'm not sure how to switch that on actually, but of course, in the youth, if you have difficulties understanding something we say on the YouTube channel, there will be captions. But if anyone knows how we can put on real life captions during a Zoom session, I would love to know. So I was saying that our team is trying to investigate all these things in different ways through philosophy of science, but also through art-based methods, through qualitative research. And we're also, in the end, our finality is to come with some kind of ethical reflection on specific aspects of neurodevelopmental, of ethical questions that come up when we are dealing with neurodevelopmental phenomena. So today, these lectures, we have been organizing these interdisciplinary lectures since the beginning of the Corona crisis, because we thought this would be a good possibility to actually invite speakers who are working on similar topics and to discuss their work and to have them present their work to us and to a general public. So we started these lectures and we have invited people from many different backgrounds, from pedagogical backgrounds, from a genetics background, from philosophy backgrounds. And all these talks are available at our YouTube channel, Neuroepigenetics. But I'm going to stop talking now because I'm not very, I'm not very fluent at the moment. But I will leave the floor to Valeria, who can introduce herself and her talk. Valeria, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to find out how I can switch off, switch on captions.
Okay, can I share the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my work. As you said, I am working at the Husserl Archives, but I have worked for 3 years at the section Phenomenological Psychopathology and Psychotherapy at the Heidelberg University Hospital. where I had a project on autism. I approached autism from a historical but also philosophical perspective. But today I will be mainly historical. I will focus on philosophical notions when I will talk about collective emotions. And basically what I would like to do today and to discuss with you is to the topic of diagnosis. So I will start about talking about what is it, a diagnosis, and also how and if we can conceive of a diagnosis as a social and political device. Then I will focus on the link between diagnosis and collective emotions, and my aim is to show how these two elements influence one another. And of course, there are some risks, and I will take into account the specific case of Asperger's syndrome, so the history of the diagnosis, how this diagnosis is born, so to say. So I will anticipate that I will use the notions high functioning, low functioning. I don't like them, but they are the notions that have been used. And one of my aim is also to show how a language is important in order to describe a disorder and also to create, why not, a disorder. And in the last part, I wanted to introduce George Frankl's contribution. George Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who worked both with Kanner and Asperger in the same years. And in my view, he gave a description of autism that is more inclusive than the ones that ruled also nowadays in the clinical debate. So let's start what a diagnosis is. So diagnosis is a medical concept which covers both the process of identifying a specific disorder and the designation of that disorder. So in this view, diagnosis concerns both the name of an illness, so it's a matter of language, and also it's a matter of values, social, cultural, and political.
Valeria?
Oh gosh.
We can't see your screen.
Okay, why? Can you see it?
Valeria, this is you. I guess you have chosen to share a specific, to share the PowerPoint, and that you are just on your screen and on others. So best is to share your desktop. So stop I'm sharing your desktop, then I don't know.
Okay.
Are you using two screens maybe?
No, desktop. Okay.
Yeah, it says that you started screen sharing, but it doesn't show anything.
It doesn't show anything. Oh, why? Usually it works.
Yeah, it worked just before, so.
So maybe I tried this one. Now it works. No. Oh gosh. I will try again. It says to me we are in the sharing screen modality. But yeah, it seems to be. So what if can I exit and then enter the meeting again? Let's see.
Yes.
It's also okay. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I'm going to try again. Is it visible?
Yes, now we see it.
So let's try. Still, can you see it?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, fingers crossed. Okay, I had just started, so it's quite easy. I was saying, what is a diagnosis? So it's a sort of medical concept which covers both the process of identifying a disease and the designation of the disease. So in this view, it concerns both language, so it's a matter of language because we need to name an illness, but it's also a matter of values. Why can we say that diagnosis is a device? So we can approach this question by at least 4 levels. Diagnosis is a device because it defines and assesses the paradigm of sanity. And as such, what needs to be pharmacologically treated or not, what needs to be hospitalized or not, and the history of institutions such as mental hospitals where people were forced to be confined is a shameful example of this. Even if still today we can observe, using Thomas Sachs' words, the pretty fine of the psychiatric plantations. But diagnosis is also a device because it affects subjectivity as such and contributes to define identity, both personal and collective. And we see now how, sorry. Can you see the screen again?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, also the chat or my slide presentations only? Okay.
We see your presentation. It's fine.
Okay. So we are starting to see this tension between the individual and the collective identity. So it will be a sort of important point in my presentation because I will show how this tension between the subjective and the collective experience rules somehow also the process, the diagnostic process. There is a sort of movement from a private subjective experience to an objectified disease. So the diagnosis has the power to transform the experience of illness, because the illness is no longer a private musing on the nature of an unexpected bodily or mental change, but an item in a medical vocabulary and ontology to which shared meanings and also knowledge are attached. But diagnosis is also a device because it contributes to enlarge inclusivity, or on the contrary, to reduce it in favor of discrimination and segregation. And lastly, it's a device because it has to do with the system of values shared by a community, impacting and influencing also the collective emotions shared by this community. So there is a sort of bilateral influence. So if we look back at the history of psychiatry during the National Socialist time, a theme already explored by the critical literature, we can find a couple of elements. Firstly, we see that in the darkest period of human history and through the unhuman use of science, disciplines like medicine, technology, and also public health were extremely advanced. And secondly, we find psychiatry within a rapid development. Doctors who lived during the Nazi era coined at least 30 eponyms among neurological and psychiatric diagnoses that are still used nowadays, formulated to the abuse and massive murders of many innocents. Another interesting element is that according to the Nazi ideology, Germany should become healthy, and again, let's keep attention to the use of language. So there is a sort of entanglement between political and medical language. And Germany should become healthy by eliminating disease, and among them also those individuals that were not able to promote the pure race, that are the disabled, the Jews because of their bad genes, and those without the metaphysical capacity for social bonds, the so-called Gemüt. And the development of eugenics and some of its particular programs, such as the sterilization of the feeble-minded, were aimed at the concept of sanity that was only for Aryans, so to say. So the relationship between political ideology, social and cultural values, and collective emotions that ground the diagnostic hypothesis is complex, of course. And it's not always possible to shed light on the limits of each element. But all of these elements contribute to the social control of a community, both in terms of creating values, beliefs, and social practice to be shared, and also in controlling the correspondence to the norms that these elements produce. So we have seen how these different components are important in the creation of the diagnosis, but today I will focus on the role of collective emotions in particular, and we enter the more philosophical part, so to say. So firstly, we need to understand the role of collective emotions in the elaboration of diagnosis and the meaning of collective emotions. So by collective emotions, I mean those emotions which are experienced by more than one subject, firstly. For instance, we feel proud if our football team is winning. We feel ashamed because of our compatriots' racism, and so on. So collective emotions have the power to strengthen the identity of a group, but also to create boundaries. And it's very important, especially in the case of the Nazi regime, to understand the subtle difference between collective emotions and group-based emotions. So the term group-based emotions concerns those emotions that are dependent on an individual's membership in a particular social group and occur in response to events that have a perceived relevance for the group as a whole. So the group has the priority. Whereas collective emotions describe emotions that are shared and felt simultaneously by a large number of individuals in a certain society. So here we don't have a specific group. So an assumption in the collective emotions literature is that the accumulation of many group-based emotions to a societal event can turn into a collective emotions. So as such, these kind of emotions are different from group-based emotions because while group-based emotions consider an individual's emotional experience as a response to group-related events, collective emotions refer to the collective as the entity that experiences the emotion. So on the one hand, yeah, we have a sum of I's, a sum of individuals, so to say. On the other hand, we have a we, a pre-reflective and felt we. And it's also interesting to notice that collective emotions presupposes another element, a specific self-experience. That is the experience of oneself as a member of a group. That is the process of group identification. And this process, according to many authors, has two different requirements in particular. A motivational phenomenological process, thanks to which there is a transformation from the self experience into a we experience, and a cognitive process, that is the adoption of the group perspectives. And this element in particular can be considered a sort of derivative form of perspective taking, because if I have learned how to adopt another's perspective, I can also learn how to adopt the group perspective. And then there is another element in collective emotions. Collective emotions presuppose something more, what Zavi called the sense of togetherness, or Campbell called openness. According to this description, we can see that we have group-based political emotions. I feel indignation in the name of my group, and collective political emotions, which are based on joint evaluations in light of political concerns in this case, not just in the name of the group, but as our affective intentional state. We are the individuals. So, and if we also think how important is the notion of conformity, especially in the elaboration of the diagnosis, we will not be surprised by the role of collective emotions, because the willingness to be conformed to a specific social model is something that already presupposes, of course, the process of group identification and is able to elicit collective emotion. So we can claim in this sense that these kind of emotions have a normative function because they have the power to strengthen and determine new ontological categories, aligning individuals around a shared evaluative perspective. I feel part of a specific group, of a we. They also have the power to reclaim moral or social norms and establish attachments to specific values. And they also influence sociological processes, which in turn can elicit new collective emotions and collective political atmospheres. Let's think about sense of justice, nationalism, public patience. And we are seeing now how this is linked to the Nazi context, because they played a very strong role. So the result seems to be a socio-material mechanism which leads to the arising of political affective arrangements, or heterogeneous and dynamic affective constellation of spontaneous way of interaction, so specific bodily alignments and ways of moving and of communications. Spatial design, again, let's think about the Nazi and fascist architecture. They had their own peculiar style. We also have symbolic and discursive orchestration of politically and socially relevant events, for instance, rituals, commemorations, and so on. But another component is diagnosis. And I wanted to call your attention about the Cambridge Dictionary definition of diagnosis. Because according to the Cambridge Dictionary, diagnosis is a judgment about a particular illness or problem. But a judgment involves morality. A judgment involves that we are analyzing an item and we are evaluating it. So it's a very strong definition. So it's important, in my view, to emphasize the double-sided nature of diagnosis, because on the one hand, we can see diagnosis as the effects of certain collective emotions, and we will see the particular case of Asperger. On another hand, diagnosis can also have the role to strengthen collective emotions and the process of group identifications, elaborating new ontological categories that differ from the normal and conformal ones. So the case study that I have chosen in order to show how strong is the link between collective emotions and diagnostic process is the case of Asperger syndrome, the diagnosis of Asperger syndrome. So we are in the context of Nazism, and it's important, of course, to realize that proper race and physiology were necessary to belong to the national community, but also community spirit was required. So one had to behave and believe at the unison with the group. And the vitality of the German people, as defined by Nazis, depended on the ability of individuals to feel it. So collective emotions became a part of Nazi eugenics, and sociability evolved into a category of persecutions alongside race, politics, religion, criminality, and also physiology. So Asperger and his colleagues developed the term Gemut. So it's very important to notice again that they developed a notion. in order to create then a diagnosis. And Gemüt was a term that originally in the 18th century meant soul. But within Nazi child psychiatry came to signify the metaphysical capacity for social bonds. So Gemüt was essential for the individual's connection with the collective. So it was a key feature for fascist feeling. And Nazi psychiatrists began to diagnose children who they said had poor Gemüt. They were Gemüt's arm. They were lacking Gemüt. Long before the very well-known diagnosis elaborated in 1944, which in any case described Asperger as a defect of Gemüt. In 1944, there was also a pamphlet written by emigrated Friedrich White and Lucas Stoiber, entitled German Psychology under the Nazi System, where they noticed how National Socialism irrationalist ideology was the expression of still deeper and more universal cultural trends. So the influence of these trends on the field of psychology was deep, and we can claim that the entire diagnosis was built upon and against the concept of Gemüt and the capacity of the subject to belong to a collective identity. And in particular, Asperger definition, Asperger concept of autism takes the word itself very seriously, because fastening the etymology autos, Greek self, it chose the term autism to designate those who he feels are most fundamentally themselves. To be oneself to such an exceptional degree entails, on the other hand, being less the other things that the average person is. So a member of society, a being used to react in certain ways that is determined by social convention rather than by one's own spontaneous impulses. So Asperger views ordinary socialization, or the being of the non-autistic person, as essentially learned, conditioned, even mechanized, everything other than spontaneous. And emphasized the autistic person's most concretely lived form of difference. So the distance between her and the society, her way of standing socially apart, in a word, her aloneness. So in this sense, the autistic person is only herself, and thus more herself than others. So this being oneself is what Asperger posits as the inner essence of autism. And this personal distance, the removal from the affective environment constituted by the social, was the key feature of autism in his view. So in 1944, he published his thesis, The Autistic Psychopath, where he described Asperger as a personality disorder. So he described these young boys of normal intelligence and language development, but who also had autistic-like behaviors and marked deficits in social and communication skills. So what it's interesting to observe in these definitions, it's not only the strictness to which he took for granted that children with Asperger syndrome were not provided at all with affective and emotional contact, so to say, but also the fact that this feature comprises many levels of autism, which are all reduced to one problem, a problem that in Asperger society was not admitted. So the judgment of the diagnosis became the synonymous with a sentence to death in the Spiegelgruppe in Vienna. But even more frightening, this diagnosis served as a moral justification, both for the clinicians who were called to serve society, and also for parents who felt part of an important and attractive we, the Nazi German soul. So how much politics and social emotions influence the elaboration of the diagnosis is evident even in Asperger wards themselves, because in 1937, in a talk entitled The Mentally Abnormal Child, and then published in the Viennese Clinical Weekly, he asserted that there are as many approaches as there are different personalities. So it's impossible to establish a rigid set of criteria for a diagnosis. A year later, in the same journal, in October 1938, in a lecture under the same name and given in the same place, introduced his own diagnosis. This well-characterized group of children who he named autistic psychopaths, because of the confinement of the self that has led to a narrowing of relations to their environment. So same disorder and two different perspectives whose destiny was decided by the meaning given to one word, diversity. So if diversity would have been considered not something to be ashamed of, and again, shame is a collective emotion, or dangerous, but something that has to be accepted and addressed accordingly, something that was not useless or dangerous for the we. Maybe also today's the studies, the educational system, and also the therapeutic hypothesis would have been completely different. So nowadays we have many different theories on autism, and both Asperger and autism have been included into the autism spectrum disorder classification by the DSM-5, and that also added the social communication disorders. Well, we can notice that all of these theories, by oscillating between neural and cognitive behavioral levels of explanations, usually rely on a rather general understanding of the individuality of the subject, and also on a rather broad understanding of intersubjectivity, because especially as philosophers, we have the lucky to know how much intersubjectivity is complex and multi-layered. So the definition used by these theories is very broad and doesn't take into account many components and many different layers of intersubjective engagement. But another interesting criticism is that they focus only on specific features such as cognitive or neural anomalies. Again, the focus is what is different from the norm. So what can we learn from the history of this diagnosis? Well, we can argue, in my view, that without the influence of a very strong political identity and without the influence of collective emotions, maybe the diagnosis of Asperger would have been focused on different topics, on different features, emphasizing the affective differences, the affective components over the withdrawal, the social withdrawal. And I ask myself, what if George Frankl would have been more famous in this context? So I'm going to, in this last part, I'm going to present his work. So George Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who had to escape from Vienna where he was working with Asperger to Maryland. During the Second World War. Then in Maryland, he ended up working with Kanner. So this is a very funny coincidence. And while Asperger focused on autism as a behavioral deficit, and Kanner focused on neurocognitive features, Frankl focused on the issue of language. So this is the main peculiarity of this approach. And he started his inquiry asking himself, how does the autistic child communicate or not communicate with the people around him? According to Frankl, it seems that the stage of autism as its complement, so to say, in the state of being in communication with people. So one is either in one condition or in the other. And starting from the assumption that talking is different from communicating, he distinguishes between affective language and word language. So affective language comprises non-verbal communicative symbolization. So we have facial expressions, gestures, embodiment, inarticulate sounds, and these gestures have validity in the subject's family, but also all over the world. And then we have the word language, that is the sum of all only verbal communicative symbolizations. And of course, our everyday language is always a fusion and integration of these two kinds of expressivity, so to say. It's very interesting, but I don't have time maybe in the discussion to see that these notions, affective language and word language, but also affective contact, have they twins in the phenomenological traditions. So basically, he described intercorporeality and interaffectivity, notions that have been developed by philosophers. According to him, the affect, so our way of communicating affect and emotions, comprises a physical component, so there is a role for the body, and intentionally communicative representations. And in order to account for these dual characterizations, Frankl makes the example of rage. Usually rage has its own bodily features that express aggressions towards somebody. I am angry at you. And also involves relationality, so to say. So rage is always towards someone or something. So in his view, a disturbance at the level of affective language, so the impossibility to understand and also to express emotions, involves a disturbance in what he calls affective contact, that is our interaffective engagement with our people. And he hypothesizes that in low-functioning autistic subjects, we have an impairment both in word language and in affective language, because they also have cognitive disorders. But he noticed that for what concerns high-functioning autistic subjects, they can maintain a speaking relationship, because of course they can talk really well, but they have problems in affective contact, in the way of communicating and understanding emotions, so to say. But in the last part of his manuscript, he hypothesized also pseudo-affective languages that we can also describe as compensatory strategies, through which the subjects copes with the human necessity of being in contact with others. In the manuscript, there are many examples. So these compensatory strategies, in his view, are usually used by high-functioning autistic subjects because they are provided with extraordinary cognitive capacities. There are 4 possible alternative or artificial affective languages in his view. We have the monotonous verbal reproduction. So these are basically, it's the phenomenon of echolalia, because we have these vocal repetitions that may assume a meaning and become a sort of substitute in the communication. Then we have the automaton-like language. Here, Frankl observed that some children do not only talk like an automaton, but also their whole body looks like a sort of mechanic support, because it misses those gestures and corporeal feature and corporeal attitude, I would say, that are typical of intercorporeality, of intersubjective expressions and communications. Then we have the scanning language. that is a rhythmical language that has no emotional connotation, so to say. It has no inflections. And this is interpreted by Frankl as the effort to recapture, if not an affective speech, at least a modulated speech structure. And then we have the declamatory language, that is the reproduction of feeling and emotions in an artificial manner, using a sort of over-dramatized inflection of the voice, like in a theatrical performance. So all of these pseudo-affective languages can be immediately perceived by the listener as something very different. But in Frankl's view, this is very important because it helps the caregivers, for instance, to adapt herself to the way of communicating of the autistic child. So it's very important, in my view, to notice that in Frankl we have an opposite direction, so to say, in respect of the, for instance, Asperger's definition, because it's not the emphasis is not on the subject that is on himself and is not able to adapt himself to the society. It's the opposite. There are exceptions, of course, to the norms, and it's up to the society, it's up to the caregivers to understand the different kinds of affective language and to tune in with this different kind of affective language. I also wanted to emphasize a couple of things that I found interesting, because so the unpublished manuscript is dated 1957, but I think that Frankl started writing very long before 1957, since when he arrived in the USA in 1944, he wrote to Kanner that he was very tired about that manuscript, that he didn't have time to finish it, and so on and so forth. And now we have a book, We Are Not Broken, written by Eric Garcia and dated 2021, where we can read firstly the emphasis on language again. We have been, Eric Garcia described autism in these terms. We have been forced to navigate a world where the road signs are written in another language, in a language that we do not understand very well. So again, it seems to be an issue of language. And then he also claims that it's society that should stop trying to cure autistic people and instead help them to live fulfilling lives. And it's the same that also Frankl tried to express through its manuscript. So I hope that the link between diagnosis and collective emotions has been clarified a little bit, and I'm also happy to have the opportunity to share with you the thought of Frankl, because I think that it deserves more attention, especially nowadays. Thanks a lot for the patience.
Thank you, Valeria, for this very inspiring talk. I suggest that I now leave the floor to Jo, who will give some comments, and then you can immediately react to that. And I will also, and after that, I will also give some remarks. Jo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valeria. It's very interesting, certainly the link which you make in the first part of the presentation. I also don't like high functioning and low functioning autism. I rarely speak the words, but given I'm here, I probably have to out myself as a high functioning autistic. And yeah, I am somehow effectively moved by some of the things that you say. So yeah, but let me make one comment and then one question, and the question is about what still disturbs me. So my comment is, we try to, I think, if you refer to Nazism and fascism, we try from our current standpoint to highlight what is different between now and then, between us liberal people and those fascist people. But I do see that there is a similarity in what you discussed about Asperger and the internal move and maybe internal struggle in Asperger, because the focus is indeed on health and judging people who cannot, let's say, in the terms of then Gemüt, but maybe in terms of now, who cannot be as productive as healthy people should be in this society, and try to, let's say, try to cure autism in order to ensure that there are more productive people, or that the people that are there are more productive. And I think that you capture this well. I think that autistic people do have a little bit of a problem with collective emotions, and are more have difficulty tuning in to those, and therefore are perceived sometimes as too much too individualistic, and therefore breaking somehow the consensus and whatever. So that's just a comment that from how you describe it with collective emotions, that maybe as liberal as our society thinks it is, we did not really transcend that type of judgment of people being dysfunctional just because they don't share the same tendency to go up in the same kind of collective emotions. But maybe just a question, and the question is about what you say, what if Frankl, and what would be different? And then what still disturbs me is what you had on slide 19, and there you quote, I think, Frankl, I don't know, but I guess it's Frankl. This expressive and intentional directness is missing in autism. Its very core seems to be exactly the inability to tune into the world. So my question is, that's Kanner. That's not Frankl. Okay, so so then you have to. Then my question is, what would Frankl have thought about that type of quote, because it wasn't put as Kanner, and I think the problem. So that's my question. So how would Frankl look at such a quote? Because I think the idea that in autism there is a problem, an affective problem, or a problem with affectivity or emotion as such, is not necessarily a more benign notion than the notion that was that you criticized in reference to Asperger. So that's my question.
Okay. So yeah, it was a quotation from Kanner, because I simply wanted to show that Kanner quoted Frankl indirectly, because he used the terms affective contact and so on. And there is a communication between them. So because in the same journal where Kanner published his famous paper, also Frankl published something, and he was supposed to publish part of this unpublished manuscript. So it's a historical retrospection, and there are some letters where Frankl tried to, Kanner tried to convince Frankl to publish that manuscript. But and they discuss this notion of affective content and so on. So basically, I think that the main difference between them is that Kanner, and even more, of course, Asperger, emphasized the fact that the autistic subject, so to say, is different from the norm. And they emphasize a lot this difference and the fact that he is by himself, by herself, and like like a dam, like a course. So we cannot do anything. It's different from the norm. It's a problem. On the other hand, the manuscript from Frankl is quite long. It's 60 and something pages. And the way he described these children, a curiosity. Among them, there is also the famous Donald triplet, the one that has been then described by Kanner. Is a little bit different because he describes the way of communicating and of expressing affectivities, and he tries to give some suggestions and some cues to caregivers, specifically to those caregivers that went to him asking for a diagnosis also, but those who were not able, to cope and to understand also these compensatory strategies, so to say. So his effort was to repristinate this affective, what he calls affective language, in order to elicit affective contact. So in his view, it's not true that autistic subjects are not interested or are not able to cope with other people. There are manners, and it's up to us, it's up to society to understand them, to understand these different ways of communication. So I find it a little bit more, inclusive, so to say. I cannot hear you.
You're still on mute.
No?
Okay, I was muted. That is so. Thank you for the trying to make the difference, but very directly the question: did Frankl, in this sense, agree to the fact that, as far as affective language, affective connection, affective communication, that there was a lack in autistic children with respect to non-autistic children? Was this still the kernel of what he believed, and that some quote-unquote high functioning could compensate for that affective lack by symbolic language, whereas others, quote-unquote low functioning, could not compensate for that affective lack by, let's say, going into symbolic or profuse language, like I use profuse language? Is that still the kernel of what he taught?
Well, yeah, basically there is still a distinction. even though I think, as far as I understood from reading the paper, that he argues that simply they have different ways of communicating emotions. And the distinction between low and high functioning is made basically because often low functioning have problems in talking more than in communicating because of the cognitive disorder. Here he speaks about severe cases, so to say. So there the problem is at the level of also talking, and it's another matter.
Yeah, so and then I leave it to Christine or to your further comment, but I think I am still disturbed by, so I understand why you think this is more positive, but I'm still disturbed. I don't think that if you frame it as a difference, that's fair enough. I think there is a difference between connecting to specifically collective emotions, to tuning in to conventions which are shared, and that makes for a more difficult language acquisition when very young, and language acquisition can to some extent compensate for, let's say, making up the difference. But I find it disturbing that is still seen as a lack, because yeah, I don't think that any autistic, whatever sublabel is given to them, can be seen as lacking something emotionally or affectively. I find that disturbing. I think that is still the same wrong premise that I think was entrenched, let's say, in the Nazi version of Asperger, or in the Nazi-influenced Asperger. So, bon, that is, I don't know. You obviously have the last word. I'm just a respondent.
No, I completely agree with you. What especially in general, with all of my research, I also from a philosophical perspective, because also from the perspective of philosophy of emotions, where we have many different layers of intersubjectivity, and I really do not agree, especially with Baron Cohen's theories, etc. I think that it's simply a different manner of living emotional experiences. And by the way, each of us has a different manner of living emotional experiences. So what I have tried to show also by collecting a lot of first-person reports, both in Germany and in Italy, is indeed what you are saying. It's not a lack, not at all. It's something different. But again, I'm also very critical towards diagnostic processes and the need that our society has of labeling. You need to be labeled, you need to perform also at work and so on. And it's something that, in my view, lies at the very ground of our society. So in collective emotions, in values, that it's like a circular process that influences the diagnostic process, mental health. It creates new diagnoses. Let's think about ADHD, which basically, what are you talking about? Does it really exist? I don't think so. So it's, yeah, I agree with you. Here it also comes the notion of language. Our language is important and also shapes values and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. I'm just going to keep my own response a bit short, because I'm very bad at giving responses, but I really enjoyed your talk, and especially, I have 3 points actually, especially how you try to understand the present practices through history, through this idea of collective emotions. And I also really enjoyed reading your paper on Georg Frankl, because I was, to be honest, I had heard the name of Georg Frankl, but I was also I was always under the impression that he was just a guy who took Asperger's ideas to Kanner. And since reading your paper, I completely, yeah, it was an eye-opener. And what was also an eye-opener was that you mentioned another person, a Russian person, Hrunia Sukareva, a woman, psychiatrist, I think, who also already in the 20s described children with who we would now probably diagnose or label as autistic. And so, yeah, this remark has nothing to do with autism, but with, yeah, how history is made through these kind of two main men, Asperger and Kanner, and we forget everything that was that all the other people that already thought about certain phenomena in history. We have also there's also a Sister Gouda in Holland who is also already using the term autistic, etc. So yeah, for me it was interesting to read how again, yeah, science is often presented as a succession of big names that think great things, but actually the truth is a little bit more nuanced. And I was, yeah, reading the story of and hearing you talk about Georg Frankl and his approach based on language, I thought that was very interesting. But still, I think, and I think you also mentioned that, I think if we compare these approaches of Asperger, who thought it was autism was a kind of personality trait or a personality disorder, who described this kind of being on your own, and Kanner, who also talks about this autistic withdrawal, and then Frankl, who talks about different types of communication. What struck me also here is that they make their diagnosis, or they're theorizing about the diagnosis based on what you can see, actually, and that's also what the DSM is about. It's behavior, it's what you can see, what's different, what's sort of different in an autistic person from a neurotypical person, without taking into account the reasons why this would be the case. What goes on inside of the child's head? What does he or she or they think about? What's the reason why they behave in a certain way? Why they use repetitive language and so on and so on. Of course, in the history of autism, psychoanalysts have tried to ask the why, to answer the why questions, but again, not in a very nice or very helpful way. So I was thinking, as you're a phenomenologist, you come from a phenomenological background. I'm just, yeah, why, people like Karel Jaspers, etc. They talked a lot about understanding in terms of, they mostly talked about adult psychiatry, and of course at that point autism wasn't yet part of adult psychiatry. So I'm just wondering whether we would have thought different about autism now if this sort of understanding perspective, if this trying to explain behavior from trying to see what goes on inside, what are the reasons behind certain behavior. Why does someone like to do repetitive stuff? Why does someone like to, I don't know, like to repeat certain words, etc., etc. Well, I think that would be very, that would have changed history, I think. And then in the same vein, yeah, but already you all said that, and you already replied to that as well. I like the idea of a different type of communication, and of course, this is also by autistic people themselves. It's often, you know, like for example, the very famous video by sorry now. Oh, I forgot. I'm forgetting their name, but in my language by Amanda. Sorry, I could have said it 1,000 times, but now I forget it. So this idea of, okay, but we do communicate, but we sort of communicate in a different way. And the way we communicate is also valuable, and it can teach us something about reality that neurotypicals may not see, etc. I find that also very interesting. So that it's not about a deficit in language, but also about, yeah, seeing things differently, being able to communicate about things differently, about using language often in a very original and a very, Amanda Bax, sorry, that was her name, in a very original way, in a very direct way, in a very creative way as such. This is also a way of looking at language in autism, but I think you would probably acknowledge that. And whether we then say that someone is non-verbal or low functioning, I don't like the term either. It doesn't matter. We can look at them having their own way of communicating that is valuable. We can try to find out a way to bridge these kind of differences in communications that we have. So that was all really that I had. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, or if you want to leave the floor to
a couple of words about phenomenology and how phenomenology, in my view, can be helpful, as you said, to understand and not only to describe, because all of these theories basically describe symptoms, describe signs, and on the other hand we have the phenomenological method that, in my view, has the advantage of going deeper, going inside the subjective experience and try to describe and then hopefully explain, but explaining is more difficult. What's going on, what does it mean? And this is the first advantage, of course. There are other two advantages, in my view, especially for understanding disorders, but also, I would say, human conditions in general. The first one concerns intersubjectivity, because thanks, I think, to philosophy of emotions in general, but also to phenomenology in particular, we have a detailed account of different kinds of intersubjective layers. And if we take into account all of these different layers, like empathy, dyadic communication, emotional contagion, group-based emotions, collective emotions, atmosphere, because also the atmospheric stage of our emotional life is important, we cannot at all say that any human being lacks intersubjectivity. Yes. And this is an advantage of phenomenology. And there is also the fact that it can be helpful in explaining, because it accounts for self as an entity that is embodied and embedded in a society and in a biological environment through this notion of circular causality. So when we take into account a specific subjectivity, we need to take into account also the context where she grew up, the society and the values shared by this society, and so on and so forth. So we need a holistic explanation, so to say, of the experience that we are trying to describe. And I tried to account and to better understand these conditions, because also in the phenomenological tradition, they use autism like the schizophrenic autism, so to say. So we cannot find a description, or in any case an analysis that put into question, that criticize the theories that we have. We only have Asperger and Kanner's theory, and that's it. And nowadays Baron Cohen mainly. And I try to talk a lot to people with the diagnosis, and I elaborated a qualitative interview, that is to say open questions and also reciprocal dialogue, where I always had in my mind these different layers. And what I can say is that basically, especially for what concern people with the diagnosis of high functioning, the problem is in mainly in collective emotions, but for instance, not at all in group-based emotions. So I like phenomenology because it also provides us with the right language. And I am also thinking about the distinction between joint intentionality and intentionality. Whereas joint intentionality is this ability to, for instance, play an online game, or and intentionality is something deeper, is linked to collective emotions. And again, also in this case, we can observe that not only autistic people are very good. So again, we are not provided at all with the right language, I can say, are very good in joint intentionality, but also schizophrenic people. So a disorder that is considered even more severe, they are very well in those tasks which involves joint intentionality. So also in that case, there is not this confined self. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. I would like to leave the floor to the rest of the audience. Does anyone have questions? You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Or maybe also, you can also put it in the chat if you are shy. Nobody has any questions? Jo, maybe you have a follow-up question on the role of phenomenology?
You surprised me, Christine. I thought you were referring to me, and I'm a little bit surprised. So can't immediately think of something except, to pick up on what Valeria said with respect to intersubjectivity. And I think also the work that Thomas Fuchs did around it, and the link with different quote-unquote pathologies. But and I think Valeria will agree. In the word intersubjectivity, at least, there are two people involved. So if there is a breakdown in intersubjectivity or a problem, it by definition is never a problem of only one of the parties. And I think still maybe that's maybe a short follow-on question with respect to phenomenological psychiatry, that the notion of diagnosis is still very much alive, in the sense that even if it's talk about problems in intersubjectivity, that the problem is still in the end for the psychiatrists, I think maybe also for practical reasons, kind of personalized into one side of the problem of intersubjectivity. I don't know whether you have thoughts on that, and I don't know, Christine, whether this is what you expected me to do.
I completely agree. Intersubjectivity is something in between. So there is I don't know if you are familiar with the work of Bin Kimura. He talks about this in between. So this Bin Kimura is a very nice Japanese philosopher. So he described intersubjectivity in terms of in between. So it's something that happens between, in the space between at least two persons. So you got the point. And I think that we can also apply this view to the so-called therapeutic phase, but also in general, because it's something that happens between, again, a couple of persons. I'm going to write in the chat the name of the Japanese philosopher. And the problem with this kind of, when you approach this kind of topic is in my view, is mainly a problem of language again. As philosophers, I think we are more free, you know, to destroy these labels. Of course, I have noticed not only the presence of a lot of reductionist psychiatrists, but also that, you know, also the psychiatric system itself requires diagnosis, for instance. So if you wanna, I don't know, simply to talk with a therapist in the public health system, at least in Germany or in Italy, because these are the public health system I am familiar with, you need, you know, a sort of certified, so to say. So it's again, it's the circularity of the structure that at a certain point breaks down. So phenomenology itself has some lacks in this concern, because I think that mental health in general is quite tricky, because at a certain point, but also medicine in general, at a certain point, the praxis, the theory meets the institutional system. So here it's quite complicated to ignore certain requirements, even though you don't believe in them. Interesting work, because I'm Italian, but I think you know him. Basaglia has written wonderful stuff about the role of institution, and he was also familiar with Merleau-Ponty. So I found his work wonderful in this regard.
Yeah, can I ask another question? It's with regard to phenomenology. I think I see also another danger, but maybe it's just because I've misunderstood Karl Jaspers or something. At a certain point, he said, if the phenomena, and he says us in the context of psychosis, become so understandable, you have to resort to explanation on a biological level. I think he says that in a certain part of his at a certain point in his allgemeine
psychopathology.
Yeah, and I see a danger there, that you're assuming, well, that a psychiatrist would assume, especially in cases of autism, which is thought of as very, very in your brain, very neurodevelopmental, very biological, that people just assume too quickly that explaining is all there is, and there is no understanding. And my response would then be, but then you have to try harder to understand, and not to just try to say, okay, this language I can totally not understand, so we'll have to find something to explain that in the brain or whatever. So yeah.
I really hope you misunderstood, because I didn't manage to read the entire Allgemeine Psychopathology, my fault, but I'm working on Jaspers right now, and this is not phenomenological at all, because it's the opposite. I mean, we can at least affirm that, okay, there is a neurobiological level, so it's but it's not sufficient to explain anything, also in terms of normality. And I am reading, on the other hand, the clarification of existence of Jaspers, especially the third volume on philosophy, where he talks about liminal phenomena and the liminality of experience and so on. There, if he wrote something, as you said, in any case, he contradicts himself, because he thinks that when we are in front of what he calls leaps, so this very strong breakdown that we are not able to cope with, we need to embrace it, so to say, we need to face them. And in his view, basically, fragility is essential. Fragility, diversity, and the liminality of experience is the essence of the sign. So it's more poetic here, I would say, and I hope not reductionist. But in any case, I would disagree with him, because we cannot reduce anything to our brain correlates. Of course, we cannot ignore them. We have a brain, but we are not our brain.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No? Then, yeah, then I will shut down the recording.